Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Mount, and I am a senior fellow here at the Public Policy Institute of California within the Water Policy Center. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring findings from two recent reports that we've completed here at the Water Policy Center. The first, implementing climate-smart tools to protect California's freshwater biodiversity, which was released last year, and the second entitled Implementing Climate-Smart Conservation Law and Institutions, just released a few weeks ago. The reports, the technical appendices, the policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can be found on our website at ppic.org. It's important for me to remind you that this research and event are supported with funding from the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the funders of the PPIC Caltrout Ecosystem Fellowship, the Rosenberg Ash Foundation, and the Windy Hill Fund. We'd like to thank them again for their support. Today's program will feature presentations from two PPIC Caltrout Ecosystem Fellows, Ted Sommer and Jennifer Harder. We will then be joined by Letitia Grenier, Senior Fellow and Director of the PPIC Water Policy Center, who will moderate a discussion on how to better protect and recover California's freshwater species in light of changing climate. And then the other factor will be she will moderate a discussion on how to better protect and recover California's freshwater species before opening it up to questions from the audience for the final 15 minutes of the program. If you have a question for our speakers, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address you see on the screen. This is important. Please do that, and we will relay it to the panel. So I want to remind everybody that PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. I would now like to welcome my friend, Ted Sommer, the PPIC Caltrout Ecosystem Fellow, to give today's first presentation.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. All right, assuming we're running here. I'm running today with a message of alarm, but also of hope. So I think it's pretty clear for everyone that climate change is hitting us in every corner of the state in a whole lot of dangerous ways. What I'd like to do today is focus on a less prominent topic, which is our freshwater ecosystems. California is blessed with everything from lakes, rivers, ponds, springs, and wetlands to all kinds of other seasonal habitats. And all of this makes us a global biodiversity hotspot. We have over 1,700 aquatic species. So besides biodiversity, these ecosystems provide clean water, recreation, economic growth, and have all kinds of cultural and social benefits. But all of this is at risk because of long-term environmental issues that folks are obviously aware of, and now climate change. So we know a lot of things are getting worse, but what can we actually do? It feels to all of us in the project team like we have a closing window of opportunity. And obviously, decarbonization of our economy has to be our top priority. But while this is happening, and even if we do the right things, we risk losing a lot of that precious biodiversity. So we were inspired to do the project because although we heard a lot of problems out there, we didn't see nearly enough thought going into what we can actually do to save our freshwater ecosystem. Simply put, we need to think more about some of our solutions. So in this project, we work with experts in California to try and develop a comprehensive list of management tools that we can use to help save these freshwater ecosystems. So I'm thrilled to report we identified 22 different tools that can be used for conservation in the face of climate change. Just for the sake of clarity, we've organized these ideas into several categories. You can think of what I'll be presenting as drawers in a toolbox. Our time is pretty limited though, so I'm just going to give you some brief examples in each category. So the biggest category in the toolbox are several types of habitat support. It is no coincidence that this is our top tier of our toolbox. Habitat actions are things that we can do that are most likely to have real ecosystem effects. And flow features prominently here. It's an essential component. It's a defining component of our freshwater ecosystems. So it again features prominently. Well, what does this actually mean in the real world? Well, right here next to me in Sacramento, Yola Bypass, our local floodplain, is a great example of what we can do at a landscape scale. So this is the largest floodplain of the Sacramento Valley. It provides rearing habitat and foraging habitat for a whole suite of wildlife and fish species. But now a couple brand new landscape level projects are going to make things even better and help us prepare for climate change. So first, at the very top of the floodplain, there's a new structure at Fremont Weir that improves the connectivity with the adjacent Sacramento River. So now various fish and other species have better access to this productive habitat, and just overall the productivity of the floodplain increases. Secondly, at the very base of the bypass, there's a brand new tidal wetlands project, the Lookout Slough Project. This is a vast network of tidal sloughs that are going to benefit a whole suite of fish and wildlife. And it gets even better because adding habitat like this helps provide flood benefits and protect our local communities. So the second drawer of the toolbox is species support. In a lot of cases, fixing habitat isn't going to happen fast enough or be at the right level to try and save individual species. And we therefore have to consider focused actions to support these individual species. So we've identified three types of species support: distribution, population, and genetics. And again, I'll just give you a brief flavor of some of these ideas. So under distribution support, a great recent example is the Klamath River Dam removal. Many species can't access the upstream cold water areas where they can get refuge from climate effects. Therefore, they need help to reclaim their historical distribution. Well, recently, three outdated dams on the Klamath River were removed. This was the largest dam removal project in history. And this opened up more than 400 miles of river habitat, allowing salmon and other species to access new areas. And I think all of us were thrilled to see that salmon have already recolonized some of these areas, returning to the Klamath Basin for the first time in more than 100 years. So one of the other big potential consequences of climate change is a loss of diversity. Because of various long-term environmental issues, species may no longer have sufficient genetic diversity to cope with the pace of change that we're seeing. And there's several potential measures that we can take to try and protect and enhance species diversity. So in this category, we have some of the more challenging ideas, such as assisted evolution. Some of the genetic options we identified included breeding programs for species to survive high temperatures and hybridization to create more resilient types. So California oyster growers are one of the groups that are leading the way here. There are projects to breed oysters that are better resistant to high temperatures that frankly are already popping up along the coastline. And finally, for some species, we may not have the will or the ability to act in time. We saw the disaster that occurred down after the Palisades fire. We need to prepare in the case of those sort of worst case scenarios. And we've identified several types of contingency actions that we should consider. So real world example here again, San Diego-based program called the Frozen Zoo. They have been working diligently for years, putting together seed banks, tissue archives, genetic libraries for a whole range of species across the planet. And although California's freshwater species are only a small part of that program, This program shows us that contingency planning is both feasible and effective. The other part of these sort of programs is that it provides, a lifeboat for future issues, future disasters, but it also gives us important data for some of the current conservation activities. So wrapping up here, again, we've identified 22 different management tools that could be considered. And I've covered only a tiny fraction of the examples that we've covered in our reports. But we do want to say that each of these tools has a number of big trade-offs, and some are much higher risk than others. We therefore advocate a decision support process to figure out what climate actions are needed in a given region. So in our report, we describe examples of how we can do decision support in a smart way and suggest how this could be conducted to create climate smart conservation plans at a watershed scale. Second, it's our intention that managers develop portfolios with combinations of tools. What we've observed over the years is that too often resource managers get stuck on just one or two approaches. So, flow is a common focus of a lot of the attention. But we want to point out that climate change is so uncertain that we need to do some bet hedging here. And so we have some suggestions on how we could build portfolios based on combinations of species, life stages, and location. And finally, we can't wait for a lot of this stuff. Some of the planning processes I just mentioned above are going to take a while, and we need to take action now. We have the long-term stress from climate change, but we have periodic disasters where we risk losing everything. So we emphasize the need to start immediately on contingency actions, pilot projects, and frankly, many types of low-risk actions that we could be doing now. So the bottom line is that we have many options. We have way more options than folks realize. And I hope folks take the time to look at the range of ideas that we describe in the reports. I do want to say that California is leading the way in several key areas, but we are running out of time. And we're hoping that sharing this toolbox will motivate decision makers and resource managers to act. So now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Jennifer Harder, my fellow CalTrout PPIC fellow, who will be doing today's second presentation.
All right, hopefully everybody can see now. Thank you for that. And Ted, thank you. That message of alarm and hope. And with those 22 tools in hand and a proposal to engage in climate smart conservation planning, the question raised for our second report was, are these tools and is this planning process legal? And if it is, what is the approval process or what is the regulatory structure that we should follow to make this happen? And that is the question we tackled in our second report. And as we researched those questions and we talked to a lot of people, there was one theme that kept emerging over and over, and that was people said, well, we can do these things, but we really need to address a question of the Federal and State Endangered Species Act, because we found that there was a perception that when people tried to do innovative things, that the acts would act as a barrier and perhaps not allow a climate smart approach. So our report took a close look at this issue, and we concluded that the Endangered Species Act, in fact, do not act as a barrier. They do allow and in fact require in some cases a climate smart approach and provide many opportunities for climate smart conservation. Now, to pursue those opportunities, we found that we need to start talking about a shift in implementation. And I want to be clear here that the report is not criticizing any particular actor in this space, no agency, no stakeholder. We highlight in the report there are great things happening in conservation. We believe when we saw that the agencies and stakeholders are working very hard, especially with limited resources. But the limited resources are the point, really. There aren't enough resources to do everything. And so we realized that we really need to focus on the most important thing. And specifically, the focus needs to be on recovery, recovering species, considering future conditions and climate change, and taking an ecosystem perspective. And to make this work, we need at least two specific things to happen. First, funding, staffing, and regulatory agendas devoted to species protection should shift to emphasize recovery. The fact is there's just not enough funding and resources to do everything, and recovery should be the thing that we do. That is, after all, the point of the both acts. And second, to accomplish recovery, everyone who works on or depends on or cares about California's rivers, freshwater ecosystems, that's advocates and stakeholders, as well as agencies, will need to embrace a greater degree of innovation and accept the risk that comes with trying new things. And the question is, why would we do something that's risky? Well, the thing is, we already are doing something that's risky. We are rapidly losing key native species, and that's proof we are on a risky path. So if we stay on that path, scientists like Ted tell us we're going to lose some of those species. So that's the big picture theme. I want to come down now to the subset of tools that Ted was talking about that are less familiar to people. And those are what we call emerging tools in the report, which are things like assisted migration, contingency actions, genetics and diversity tools, and even focusing on hatchery reform. And there was a question, a bigger question on these than on things like habitat restoration as to whether they were legal. And so the report investigated that question and found that yes, almost always you can actually pursue these tools. The law is there and provides a framework for approval. And so the report describes the process that's available to implement these tools. And in this regard, I'll just point out that whenever you do work that might impact a listed species, you have to think about whether you need a government approval. And in this regard, most people think of something called incidental take, meaning they get permission to take an action that may harm species. But in this scenario, when we're talking about these emerging tools, there's actually a special process for activities involving scientific research or where the primary purpose is to recover species. And the report refers to these as research and recovery permitting processes. And these are available under both the Federal Act and the State Act and other provisions of the Fish and Game Code. Now, each of these pathways is a little bit different, but the point here is there's definitely a clear process for approving the use of the emerging tools. So building on these analyses, our report recommends some specific actions, including development of those climate smart conservation plans that Ted mentioned, strengthening the law on species recovery, and developing policy for some of those emerging tools I just discussed. Now, some of these policies on these emerging tools actually already exist at the federal level, such as, for example, assisted migration, moving species out of their current habitat into new habitats to accommodate climate change, and something called experimental populations, which is a technique that the federal government can use under the federal ESA to identify a particular population and tailor the protections to ensure, and this is used when species are moving into historic or sometimes new habitats, tailor the protections to work with landowners or other stakeholders in the area. Now, one thing we want to emphasize here is Ted's point that with the contingency actions, there is a real opportunity here Preserving that information about the species is something that we can easily do with these permitting pathways and may protect opportunities to protect the species at all in the future. So we have two recommendations for the state, in addition to focusing on recovery, which is to develop policy for those emerging tools and also to fund these contingency actions as a high priority. And a final recommendation I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on is the issue of institutional culture and environmental law. So there's a number of ways in which our report emphasized that the law can be strengthened. But by and large, what we heard was that current law is not the barrier. So the question became, well, then if current law is not really a barrier, why are people nervous about undertaking these climate smart tools? Why are we not doing conservation in a climate smart way right now? And we found in talking to people that the challenge and the opportunity lie in organizational culture. Now, here, I want to back up and say that most of our environmental laws were designed based on the assumption that the environment is static, that it stays the same. But thanks to our scientists like Ted, we now are fully aware that the environment is actually dynamic. It constantly changes, and climate change is ramping up the pace of that change and making it more predictable. So our approach to environmental protection has to shift to accommodate that ongoing change, and I'll highlight 4 ways. First, we need a new governance approach, and that here I would highlight that watershed level planning to implement climate smart conservation plans. This is discussed in detail in our report and in Ted's presentation. Second, we need to be more nimble. Management decisions take a long time to process, and our governance processes don't keep up with the needs of species. Third, we need to not only collect more data, but we also need to improve the ability to use that data in meaningful ways, to find a way to catch and process and apply that data in a nimble fashion quickly. And finally, we have to learn how to design flexible standards that will allow us to address those changing conditions and new information as we get it, but also maintain accountability and transparency in those standards. So here's our final recommendation, and this is perhaps the most important one. We found that in most public and private organizations engaged in the water and environmental law community, there are great intentions, but there's an institutional tendency to avoid taking risks. And that comes from many different sources, not the least of which is that we're all working in this world where we're used to reacting to the paradigm of a static environment and not trying to work within a dynamic one. So in order to tackle this imminent crisis, this alarm that Ted underscored, we need to find ways to support each other in taking bold action. And this will require messaging from leadership and support and commitment from leadership and commitment from the entire water and environmental law community to embrace risk and be nimble and reward innovation. And if we can find a way to do that, then I would underscore the hope that Ted has. We are doing a lot of great things in freshwater ecosystems right now. And I see the potential for us to come together to really tackle this in a new way going forward. So I want to highlight here that now there will be an opportunity for people to submit questions to remind you about the email for asking those questions. And now I would like to welcome back my co-fellow Ted Sommer, as well as Letitia Grenier, the director of the PPIC Water Policy Center and PPIC Senior Fellow, who will moderate our discussion today.
Hi, Ted and Jennifer. Thank you so much for those presentations. That was great. I'm really excited to chat with you a little bit deeper about what you were telling us, and then we'll be opening this up to the audience for your questions around 11:45. So first of all, you're working on these sort of new innovations. What surprised you as you got into this research? Let's start with Ted.
Yeah, so one of the things we did was interviewed a whole suite of experts, but also we reviewed a whole lot of different climate adaptation plans, both in the US and abroad. And one of the things that really surprised us was the lack of contingency planning. Everyone had lots of good habitat actions, some of the other species-specific thing, but it was stunning that this was such a big gap. And it is a little bit of a doomsday planning exercise, but at the same time, we need to accept that we need to preserve whatever we can. The other thing I want to mention is when Jeff Mount and I first met to brainstorm about this project, is we envisioned this as a little bit more of a futuristic sci-fi effort. Let's really go wild and think about wild ideas. But actually, when we started doing our research, we found that a lot of the crazier ideas people are actually trying already. So one of the examples was robotics, using that to help control invasive species. We thought, wow, very Star Wars sci-fi. But actually, over the past year, folks have been working up in Lake Tahoe with autonomous units to actually, control some of the aquatic weeds up there.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Ted. How about you, Jennifer?
Yeah, so when I started looking into this question and talking with people, and we were hearing that, oh, the ESA is a problem, the ESA is a barrier, and we need to be thinking about this differently. I thought that the question of whether species protection laws is effectively addressing climate change and that governance process is effectively addressing climate change. It seemed like an innovative thing to ask. I thought, oh, I'm going to be poking at the Endangered Species Act, for which we all have a high regard. And as it turned out, I was really surprised to find that there are many, many people out there, many much smarter than I am, who have been discussing this question. And for at least 15 years, they've been talking about this same question. There's a wealth of literature out there written by environmentally minded law experts and a whole mess of policy experts and scientists who say that we need to be thinking about this differently, and that in fact we can be thinking about this differently without needing to amend the Endangered Species Act, that there are a lot of measures we can take. And that we should be thinking about things like future conditions, thinking about the ability to be nimble in order to protect biodiversity and ecosystems and to address ongoing change. So I thought that was really interesting, that this wasn't as new an idea as I thought. The other thing I was surprised to find is that there was an active and robust conversation around the need for these emerging tools that Ted identified, things like assisted migration and hybridization and genetics techniques like epigenetics. Like these were not, there's a big conversation out there. People are obviously concerned to make sure that they evaluate the risks, but they are being used more than I imagined, and they have a lot more support than I imagined, even among governing agencies and environmental advocates. And this conversation goes back again about a decade. So I thought that was surprising and heartening.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too as we went through this research together. So we've got the new tools. People are already using them a little bit. It's legal to put the Endangered Species Act, to implement it this way, but we don't do it very much. So, what is going on with implementation, and how would you change the implementation of the Endangered Species Act in order to make them actually more effective in recovering species?
So I think that when we are talking about approaching the ESA differently, I want to come back to this idea that we need to focus on recovery. And we can talk about the nuts and bolts of how to do that. But I think it really comes down to generally focusing our resources, our time and money and regulatory agendas, shifting that away from where we seem to spend most of the time, which is on government process around project by project mitigation. That's important, and we need to keep doing that. But what we need to realize is that when we focus only on that, at best, what we end up with is holding the line on the status quo and not improving things for species in the bigger picture. So we are talking about investing financial and regulatory and community resources into big picture gains, net improvements in ecosystem function, to support entire communities of species and habitats, not only those currently listed, but species that are not yet listed, to keep that endangered list from growing longer. And I think we need to be thinking more about how conditions will be different in future. I mean, I think there's a general acknowledgement that climate change is happening and that we need to talk about its impact, but we need to tailor our actions to recognizing that reality, and becoming more innovative in the actions as a result, becoming more nimble as a result, being able to shift course quickly in our regulation and management is going to be really important. And so we have a technique we've used for a long time to try to do that. It's called adaptive management, right? I know a lot of people are thinking about adaptive management. We already try to manage change in real time. And the thing is that we don't do adaptive management very well yet. And I think that the issue here is that we're trying to fit adaptive management into an existing structure of laws that look at the environment as a fixed and static thing, and we plug them into bureaucratic regulatory process. And that keeps us, it's a square peg in a round hole. It keeps us from being able to react quickly. So we need to be talking about governance processes and decision-making processes that are themselves adaptive, right? And that allow the opportunity to make decisions quickly, to adapt to new information quickly, because the one thing we know about climate change is that change is ongoing and it's unpredictable. So we have to learn to respond.
Yeah, that would be a big change for us to get away from set it and forget it type of regulation towards something more dynamic and adaptive. Ted, I want to ask you the same question. What changes would you make to how the ESAs are implemented?
Yeah, I'll mention a few things. One of the first things is that we need to move beyond the single species focus. Only a small percentage of our aquatic species in California have any kind of legal protection. And so much of the focus is on protecting in a given waterway, a small subset. And I understand, the ways the laws are written is focused on, those individual species. But whatever we can do to increase the breadth of our action is going to be important progress. The second thing, and I mentioned this in the presentation, is increased use of available tools. So often our actions are really focused on just one or two measures that we're going to use to protect species from take or try and recover some of the habitat. And lastly, I'll mention the pace of action. Climate change is happening way faster than most of us expected. And despite significant advances in permitting, habitat improvement projects still take way too long. And again, if you've got climate accelerating, we need to pick up the pace. And Letitia, I think you could speak to some of the measures that we might be able to take to increase the rate at which we're getting restoration projects off the ground.
Absolutely. We would all love to see that happen. One thing that went by kind of quickly in the presentation that I wanted to talk about a little bit more is legal flexibility. Jennifer, you mentioned this. What does that mean? It sounds a little scary. Can that kind of thing be misused, or how does it work?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. So when we're talking about flexibility, we're talking about two things here. And one some people say, is the Endangered Species Act flexible enough to allow us to take an ecosystem approach and to consider future conditions, right? So that's one question. And I would say absolutely yes. The Endangered Species Act, the whole point of the act is to recover species, and the best available science tells us that you need to pay attention to ecosystem condition if you're going to effectively protect species. So we're talking in that case about flexibility that favors environmental protection. We're just looking at, instead of, as Ted said, isolating the species, we're looking at it from an ecosystem perspective. And the concept of flexibility is even broader than that, right? All of these experts who are talking about the need to shift how we do environmental protection and climate change talk about flexibility. And what they're referencing, whether it's ESA or Clean Water Act or anything else, is the ability to respond to change by being able to take a different management action or by changing your objective partway through. And that's where we get into flexibility. And you're right, flexibility has a bad reputation, in part because it's usually invoked to justify less protection for species, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about flexibility that breaks in favor of species. And of course, anything that you build in that has flexibility can be misused. So we want to make sure to address that potential when we craft flexibility. And there's ways we can do that, specifically by focusing on supporting accountability and transparency. So some of the ideas around that are, you can create flexibility within fixed parameters. So there are clear limits to the ability to shift without needing some more formal approval, official input. You can set those boundaries through public process that includes notice and comment. You can limit flexibility in time, putting dates on which it sunsets. You can require monitoring and reporting where the data and reports are made open and public. You can have advisory committees where you have the advocates and the water users and others who are all part of the process. And that is being done on some processes that use this kind of flexibility now. And you have to just generally make sure to build in those effective feedback and enforcement mechanisms that will allow correction if the flexibility is misused. So it's a matter of detail and context, but I think we can do it just to make sure it, as we say, breaks in favor of the environment, protecting the environment.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm thinking about what needs to change. It sounds like the endangered species laws themselves don't necessarily need to change to do the kinds of work that you two are talking about. But are there legislative things that should happen? Like, what's the most important thing the legislature should do to support this kind of advancement? And I'll give that to both of you. So let's start with Ted.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned in the talk, I think decarbonization is number one. That's the big driver. And California is making progress there. And I'm proud of that. But at the same time, I don't know that folks understand the urgency of acting now to save our ecosystems. A lot of folks see climate change as this long, slow process that's slowly squeezing things. But we see disasters like the Palisades fire, like different, drought things, floods, so many destructive events that we need to recognize that we are losing species now. And even if we do all the right things with decarbonization, we will lose species unless the legislature and others make it a top priority. And the key thing there, of course, is we need dedicated resources for climate adaptation. And that includes funding for pilot projects, but also for things like contingency planning and a number of the other tools we listed.
Thanks. What would you say, Jennifer, to that?
So a couple of things. And first, I've been talking about strengthening the recovery requirement. And I want to underscore here that at both the federal and state level, there is a requirement to issue recovery plans, but those recovery plans are largely non-binding. And so one of the things we need to be talking about is there an opportunity to make recovery binding, at least in some circumstances, and maybe with some ways in which we provide some tailored protections to ease the burden on people. When we talk about recovery at the federal level, there's actually an affirmative recovery obligation on the federal government under the Endangered Species Act. This isn't the jeopardy provision we usually think about. This is actually a companion provision that says that the federal government has to use, all federal agencies have to use their authorities to protect and recover endangered species. And so we could be talking more about that. There's a similar provision in state law under the California Endangered Species Act. The state legislature is in a really great place to, as Ted said, assert some leadership here, provide some leadership here. And in some ways, they've started to do this. In 2018, the legislature enacted a law that authorizes the Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop non-binding, but recovery plans for CISA species. And there's a few things that are interesting in that directive, which is that there was direction to prioritize species likely to be affected by climate change, land use, or changing aquatic conditions. So that was really interesting. And that priority was assigned without regard to taxonomic classification. Those are both things that are really helpful in climate change. Now that law was made dependent on the availability of funding. So I want to underscore here the need for more funding in this regard. CDFW is posed to issue regulations on those recovery plans. And I've been watching those, and actually within the last couple of weeks, it's been announced that the draft guidelines, not regulations, but guidelines for recovery should come out in May. So that's coming up. The other thing I think we should be thinking about is whether it's really most effective to have the agencies, or when we're talking about rivers, the water users in charge of managing environmental condition. And one of the ideas that PPIC has come up with in the past that I think is we really need to pay attention to, and this is where the legislature can make a difference as well, is in appointing an independent trustee who will be in charge of managing flow and monitoring environmental conditions and identifying actions to benefit the environment in climate change. This is such an important idea, because if you have a dedicated trustee, then their attention isn't diverted by other things. Their sole purpose is to do what's right for the species. And they can take actions, be at the table there, and maximize environmental benefit. So we sometimes refer to these as environmental water managers. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity. PPIC has identified that if we were to provide water assets to these independent trustees, such as storage in the reservoirs, we could make a big difference on combating some of these climate issues in our freshwater ecosystem. So I would highlight that as a thing to pay a lot of attention to.
Thanks. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of opportunity and some good marching orders there for our legislature. I have so many more questions for you, but we should switch over now to audience questions. Really like to hear from everybody who's joining us online. I'll start with Selene, I hope I'm saying that right, Martinez, who's at McGeorge School of Law. She says, what role, if any, can fish hatcheries play in promoting genetic diversity? What are the pros and cons of fish hatcheries? That's definitely one for you, Ted, I think.
Okay. Yeah, hatcheries featured pretty heavily in our range of tools, and in kind of two totally different ways. First is as a stressor. There have been some long-term issues from the operation of hatcheries, where hatchery stocks start competing with wild fish and wild diversity. So at the one end, we have ideas including relocating hatcheries, moving them kind of away from where wild fish are spawning to try and give some of the wild fish an edge. And one of the more radical ideas was just closing some of the hatcheries that may be causing most of the issues. But the other side of this is hatcheries may also be able to take the lead in protecting and enhancing diversity. So some of the breeding programs that are underway in hatcheries right now are using really state-of-the-art techniques to try and maximize the diversity of populations. And maybe in the future, there's the potential to use some of those breeding programs actually to select for individuals that might be able to better cope with our climate future.
Yeah, there again, I hear opportunity. There's possibilities there, but we got to do some innovative thinking and change management approaches. We do have a question along the lines of getting to that innovation and the risks that come with them. So David Maldoff of DWR is asking, could the speakers talk more about taking risk? Who should be taking the risk and what are the risks? And I'm going to start with you, Ted, talking about the biological risks associated with some of your ideas.
Yeah, I want to start with something Jennifer said by acknowledging that what we're doing right now is not working, and we need some bold action if we're going to be successful. But yeah, bold action means more risk. One of the things that I've advocated and is described in the report is, again, this portfolio idea. We have a lot of options here, and the different management tools can be applied at different levels, from full scale to pilot scale to laboratory scale. By trying multiple things, this is similar to the mutual fund financial example, but we are spreading our risk out, and we are more likely that at least one or more actions will work. The key to doing that, though, is having these actions at multiple scales. And again, having laboratory scientific support, having pilot projects where we can learn from and monitor and improve the way we're doing things are all key parts of it. And lastly, there's the idea of using structured decision making. That's a formal process to lay out what some of the options are and explicitly describe the uncertainty, but also the potential benefits. So we can kind of go into this in an informed way and figure out, for a given species, for a given watershed, what really makes the most sense.
Thank you. And I want to turn that question to Jennifer too, because I know one of the things you were talking about is how can we get institutional culture to change and be willing to take more risks? What are you talking about there and how can we incentivize that?
Yeah, when we think about doing bold things in this space, I think that we have to recognize that everybody is aware of the potential for litigation to be challenged in court, and that drives a lot of the hesitancy to try something new. So I think a couple of things about that. And one is we have to remember that the reason we're doing these things is to save species. And as Ted says, we're on a downward trajectory with a lot of the species in that regard. So we need to do something different. And when we think about litigation risk, there are ways in which we can minimize that risk, certainly. Process matters. So if we've recommended a process that involves some degree of, for example, state leadership around direction and policy, but then working the issues through a more local process at the watershed level and engaging people in that process can be part of what reduces risk. The agencies also in this space have a mandate to pay attention to the science, and so building records around what that science is. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty, but how they've used things like structured decision making to address that uncertainty, and tracking that can really help. And then finally, how do you deal with the human element? And I think this is an area where we haven't had enough conversation yet. And I'm excited about the fact that we're starting to have this conversation in water and environmental law. When we think about the need to address ongoing change in our ecosystems, we need to build capacity to do that in our organizations, both public and private. And that's going to involve, as I mentioned, signaling from leadership. You can have people within organizations who are champions of these ideas, who embody, who have the training and the skills to navigate ongoing change, and they can serve as models and supporters for others. You can provide training generally, integrating questions about future conditions and ongoing change and options and risks into every sort of standard checklist. The checklist should ask, how are you being innovative? You know, what sort of a new thing are you trying, given the imperative we're facing? You can also be thinking about structural things like management and staff compensation, performance review, promotion and recognition structures, all structured to recognize and support innovation and risk taking. So if we get creative around those things, we might be able to shift culture so that we can keep up with the changes and the unpredictability in our ecosystems.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. I want to remind everyone online, you can still submit your questions to this email address, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. It's not too late. We'd love to hear from you. All right, we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to combine a couple of thoughts here. We have a question from Verna Jagur who asks, would moving beyond single species focus look something like the Natural Communities Conservation Program, or NCCPs, that we're probably all familiar with? And I'll just pose that, I'll add to that, say, you know, I hear a lot from you about ecosystem-based management. So can you tell us, like, what is different about ecosystem-based management versus something we already have, like the NCCPs? And I'll leave it open to either of you to who would like to start.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that question. So PPIC has done a lot of work around ecosystem-based management, and I would refer people to the reports that were done back in 2019, 2020. There are a number of reports, including more recently talking about ecosystem-based management. And this is as much thinking about the whole ecosystem. When we talk about ecosystem, we think about socio-ecological ecosystem. So thinking about integrating people and the environment at the same time. And we want to think about not only those listed species, but also the species that are as yet unlisted. The questioner asked about the natural communities conservation planning, and we have a number of other sort of structures that provide us some opportunities to think at that level. And some of those are promising. I think one of the things we've run into with NCCPs and others is that, again, they're taking place within this classic process where we have a lot of governance that we have to follow, a lot of regulations. We're trying to do nimble things, but we're still stuck with those same old standards. So I think we need to think more systemically about what we're doing. And some of the things that others have pointed out are, we could be thinking about when we're listing species, you could think about identifying in the listings species as in groups, depending on their vulnerability to climate change, their ability to be resilient under future conditions, and thinking about how all of that connects to things like biodiversity, right? Having that big picture. You can design your regulatory standards to be responsive to those things, whether it's take or designing recovery plans, hopefully with a little more oomph than they have today. So there's a lot of opportunities to be working through this at a faster pace, with a bigger lens, right? Looking at not just the isolated species, but the whole ecosystem. And again, I think it comes back to this idea, we can't just plug that square peg in a round hole. We need to rethink the governance process and figure out, how can we do this faster? How can we do this more nimbly while also protecting transparency and accountability? And we tend to err on the side of slowing things down to be cautious. And what's happening is the exact opposite of what we want is happen. We're slowing things down to be cautious, and we're just losing those species. So maybe we try something different now.
Thanks. We've got time for one last question. I'm going to throw it toward Ted. And this is about the YOLO floodplain, which is one of these places that has multiple different stakeholders. You're having to balance different uses at different times and different kind of water years. So the questioner would like to know, in this place with many stakeholders with different interests, could you describe the interests and how they might be reconciled?
So Yellow Bypass has been a great experiment in how to try and bring groups together or not to make something happen. Some of the early work with YOLO Bypass actually came together pretty quickly, in my opinion, for wetlands in the area, managed wetlands for waterfowl. Some of the local advocacy groups managed to work with agencies and lawmakers and bring things together. So you had a local point group to push things. For aquatic restoration, it was actually a harder road because it came out of more research that some of us were doing, and the agencies were leading the charge. And agencies aren't always particularly effective at working with local groups. And so what it frankly took was many years of working through watershed groups with communication to answer a lot of the issues. And more importantly, doing some demonstration projects to kind of show specifically what people were talking about. And those demonstration scale projects really improved people's confidence levels. So that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about the idea of pilot projects with regard to some of these climate actions. I think it really helps people understand, and it reduces risk with regard to what we're trying to do.
Wonderful. We're going to end on that great example of how it can be done. Not easy work, but very effective after lots of effort. The YOLO Bypass is so important. So I want to thank Ted and Jennifer, both of you, for your presentations and this great research, and for being here for our discussion. Thank you to Jeff for our introduction. And I'd also like to thank our funders, the SD Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the funders of the PPIC Caltrout Ecosystem Fellowship, the Rosenberg Ash Foundation, and the Windy Hill Fund. We really appreciate your support. And thanks to all of you for being here to chat with us and learn more. We loved talking to you about it. We'd love to get your feedback about this. If you pre-registered, you'll get an email later today with a link to a short survey, or you can just scan the QR code that's on your screen right now. And finally, as Jeff mentioned before, a recording of this event will be available on the PPIC website and our YouTube channel soon. So you can watch it again, or we'd love it if you shared it with your networks. Thanks again so much for joining us. Have a good afternoon.